Something is unfolding right now along the banks of the Jordan River, and very few are willing to say out loud what it could mean. Over the past several days, the river has behaved in ways that even seasoned observers struggled to explain. The current hesitated. The water shifted color. Low vibrations were felt beneath the ground, and as the levels dropped, something long hidden beneath the surface began to appear. There has been no major headline, no urgent panel discussion, no clear narrative offered to the public. Because how do you frame a story like this? The Jordan is not an ordinary river. It has marked crossings, covenants, turning points. In Scripture, it is associated with transition, with moments when history moves from one chapter to the next. And now, in a compressed span of days, instability has exposed what centuries kept covered. Stay with me, because we're going to examine exactly what was recorded, what was seen, and why this moment is drawing global attention. If you're interested in careful investigations that separate speculation from observable fact, make sure to like this video and stay with us, because this may only be the beginning. The Jordan River has always followed a predictable rhythm. Even during drought cycles, the water moves with quiet consistency, and that is why what happened earlier this week stood out so sharply. Shortly after midday, people who are being baptized along one segment of the river registered a subtle but measurable disruption. The change lasted only minutes. Flow velocity dipped unexpectedly, then stabilized. At nearly the same time, witnesses standing along the bank reported something harder to quantify. They said the river seemed to pause. One pilgrim described the surface as smoothing out unnaturally fast, as if wind and current had briefly canceled each other out. Another said small ripples began moving in an unusual cross pattern before fading. None of this was dramatic. There were no towering waves or visible surges, but rivers do not simply hesitate without cause. Scientists reviewing the data proposed several possible explanations. Upstream water management could have temporarily reduced release volumes. Underground sediment shifts might have altered the channel floor just enough to affect surface behavior. Each explanation was plausible, yet two details complicated the picture. First, no scheduled upstream regulation matched the exact timing of the event. Second, there were no seismic readings strong enough to indicate tectonic movement beneath the area. The fluctuation remained small, but it was real. In isolation, such an anomaly might have passed without notice. Rivers are dynamic systems. They respond to invisible forces constantly: pressure, erosion, temperature gradients. A brief irregularity does not automatically signal something extraordinary. But context matters. This particular stretch of the Jordan River is not only hydrologically monitored, it is symbolically significant. It is visited daily by pilgrims, historians, and researchers. Cameras are almost always present. That means deviations, even minor ones, are far more likely to be observed and recorded. And within hours of the slowdown, social media clips began circulating. Viewers slowed the footage down frame by frame. Some insisted the river was simply reflecting light differently. Others pointed to the instrument data as confirmation that something measurable had occurred. Experts urged caution. They reminded the public that rivers are complex, living systems. Even subtle atmospheric changes can alter surface tension and flow rate. To assign meaning too quickly would be irresponsible. Still, the timing was difficult to ignore. Because only days before, water levels had already been trending lower than seasonal averages. Exposed patches of riverbank were widening. Stones normally submerged were beginning to show. Then came the brief hesitation. It lasted minutes, but it triggered a tension that would only intensify in the days ahead. If the story had ended there, it would have remained a technical footnote, a minor fluctuation in a river long accustomed to scrutiny. Instead, it was only the first sign that something else was about to surface. The slowdown might have faded into a technical report, a brief anomaly logged and archived, if not for what happened next. Days later, just after sunrise, visitors standing along the banks of the Jordan River noticed something that did not require instruments to detect. A patch of water near mid-current had changed color. At first, it appeared faint, a diluted red tint spreading across the surface in irregular shapes. In certain angles of light, it looked almost copper. From higher ground it was unmistakable, a discolored band drifting slowly downstream. Within minutes, phones were raised, photos were taken, live streams began. Unlike the earlier flow disruption, this was visible to the naked eye. Local authorities moved quickly to collect samples. Preliminary statements suggested a possible algal bloom. Certain microorganisms can produce pigments ranging from rust red to deep crimson under specific environmental conditions. Others pointed to iron-rich sediment stirred from the riverbed as water levels shifted. Both explanations were scientifically credible. Rivers around the world have turned red before due to algae, mineral runoff, or industrial discharge. On paper, nothing about a temporary color change demands supernatural interpretation. But again, context mattered. The discoloration appeared in the same general region where the river's current had hesitated days earlier. It followed a period of unusually low seasonal flow, and it surfaced in one of the most symbolically observed waterways in the world. Footage showed the red-tinted water moving in uneven streaks, as if emerging from below rather than washing in from the banks. Some witnesses insisted the color seemed to rise upward in thin plumes before dispersing. Others said the tint deepened briefly before fading back toward its normal tone. Laboratory testing would take time. Initial field readings detected no immediate signs of toxic contamination. Oxygen levels remained within acceptable ranges. Fish activity did not show obvious distress, yet uncertainty persisted. Because while scientists evaluated chemical compositions, the public conversation was moving faster. Online forums debated whether underground sediment pockets had been disturbed by subtle shifts beneath the channel floor. Environmental analysts examined satellite imagery, comparing coloration patterns to previous years. Some concluded that lower water levels may have concentrated naturally occurring minerals, amplifying their visual impact. Still, one detail stood out. The discoloration was localized. It did not extend for miles. It did not appear upstream in equal intensity. It emerged within a contained stretch, then gradually dispersed. By late afternoon, the river's surface looked mostly normal again. The red tint thinned, blending back into the green-brown flow typical of the region. To some observers, that resolution reinforced the idea of a natural cause. But to others, the sequence felt layered. First, the river slowed. Then, days later, its color shifted. Individually, each event had plausible explanations. Together, they formed a pattern that was harder to dismiss casually. Researchers cautioned against drawing connections too quickly. Environmental systems are complex. Coincidences happen. Seasonal transitions can produce clusters of anomalies. Yet, even cautious analysts admitted something unusual. The timing was remarkably tight. And while laboratory results were still pending, another development was already unfolding, one that could not be captured fully in photographs. Because as night fell over the banks of the Jordan River, residents nearby began reporting something they could not see at all. They could only hear it. By the time the water returned to its normal color, public attention had already begun to settle. Preliminary analyses suggested mineral disturbance or biological activity. The slowdown in current had plausible hydrological explanations. On the surface, the story appeared to be stabilizing. Then the nights changed. Residents living near a monitored stretch of the Jordan River reported a low, sustained vibration just after midnight. It was not loud. It did not resemble thunder, engines, or construction. Those who heard it described something deeper, a muted resonance that seemed to rise from below the ground rather than travel through the air. One witness compared it to standing near distant industrial machinery, except there were no facilities operating in the area at that hour. Another described a rhythmic pulse lasting roughly 3 to 4 minutes before fading completely. What made the reports harder to ignore was their consistency. Within 2 nights, multiple accounts surfaced from locations along the same general stretch of river where the slowdown and discoloration had occurred. Some individuals recorded faint audio clips on their phones. The sound was subtle, almost lost beneath ambient noise, but analysts later confirmed that a low-frequency pattern could indeed be detected. Seismic monitoring stations in the broader region did not register a conventional earthquake. No tectonic tremor of measurable magnitude was recorded at the time of the reported vibrations. However, micro-tremor data, extremely small ground oscillations often filtered out of public reports, showed slight irregular pulses that researchers are still evaluating. Geophysicists proposed several possibilities. Subsurface sediment shifts can create brief acoustic phenomena, especially in river systems experiencing fluctuating water pressure. As water levels drop, voids beneath compacted layers can redistribute stress. In rare cases, gas pockets trapped in sediment release upward, producing both vibration and low-frequency sound waves. All of these mechanisms are known to science. None require extraordinary assumptions. Yet the pattern continued to raise eyebrows. The vibration reports occurred within the same week as the river's temporary slowdown and visible discoloration. The geographic overlap was narrow, the timeline was tight. Environmental systems are interconnected, that much is clear. Changes in water pressure can influence sediment stability. Sediment movement can alter coloration. Structural shifts beneath a channel can create sound. In theory, each event could be linked through natural processes. But researchers acknowledged something else. The clustering was unusual. Normally, minor anomalies in river behavior disperse across time. A slight slowdown 1 month. A localized algae bloom another season. A subtle sediment vibration during a separate pressure cycle. Here, they appeared layered. Observers who revisited the earlier footage of the water hesitation began looking more closely. Some speculated that the riverbed itself might be adjusting. Lower seasonal levels had already exposed stones not seen in years. Sections of bank were widening. Shallow zones were becoming visible. If subsurface changes were occurring, they might not remain hidden indefinitely. Authorities did not issue warnings, but monitoring activity increased. Additional measurements were taken along vulnerable segments. Hydrological models were updated to account for the recent irregularities. Meanwhile, the public conversation intensified. Skeptics emphasized the power of coincidence amplified by symbolism. Believers pointed to the rare convergence of events within a historically significant river corridor. Analysts urged patience while more data accumulated, and then, as the water level continued to trend lower than expected, something else began to emerge. Not beneath the surface this time, but above it. Because as the river receded inch by inch, a series of straight-edged forms started to break through the waterline. Shapes that did not look like sediment. Shapes that looked deliberate. By the end of the week, water levels along parts of the Jordan River had dropped just enough to expose features no one had noticed before. At first, they looked like ordinary stones. Irregular shapes catching the light differently as the river receded. But as more of the riverbed became visible, the alignment began to stand out. Several blocks appeared in a near-linear formation. Not scattered, not randomly deposited by current, but positioned in a way that suggested intent. Local observers were the first to document it. Drone footage captured a clearer view from above. A faint rectangular outline partially submerged, its edges too straight to dismiss casually. The stones were not polished smooth by erosion. They held angles, subtle but distinct. Within days, archaeologists were contacted. Preliminary surveys avoided dramatic conclusions. River systems often conceal remnants of old crossings, collapsed banks, or ancient retaining walls. Throughout history, waterways shift course. Structures once built near the edge can end up underwater centuries later. That explanation was immediately considered. The Jordan Valley has been inhabited for thousands of years. Civilizations rose, traded, worshipped, and disappeared along its banks. It would not be surprising to uncover foundations, docks, or ritual platforms lost beneath layers of sediment. But again, timing became part of the story. The exposed formation was located within the same general stretch where the current briefly slowed. The water turned red. Low-frequency vibrations were reported. Individually, each event had plausible natural explanations. Now, the river itself seemed to be unveiling something physical. Archaeologists approached cautiously. Sediment layers were examined to determine whether the stones had shifted recently or had been resting undisturbed for centuries. Initial assessments suggested the structure was not newly formed by natural collapse. The edges bore signs consistent with human shaping, though erosion had softened many surfaces. If confirmed, the formation could represent part of an ancient riverside installation, possibly a crossing point, a defensive boundary, or a ritual site from a period long before modern records. No inscriptions were immediately visible, no artifacts lay openly beside it, but the geometry was difficult to ignore. Experts reminded the public that lowered water levels often reveal forgotten history. Droughts have exposed entire cities beneath reservoirs in other regions. Rivers are archives. When they retreat, they sometimes give back what they have carried for generations. Still, the layered sequence of events was now impossible to overlook. Hydrologists proposed that reduced water pressure may have altered sediment distribution, gradually uncovering what had always been there. Geologists suggested that subtle subsurface adjustments could have accelerated exposure. Archaeologists emphasized patience, careful excavation, careful dating, careful interpretation. No one declared it a miracle, no one declared it a warning, but no one dismissed it outright either. Because in highly monitored environments, anomalies rarely cluster so tightly without an underlying connection. Whether that connection is purely geological or part of a longer environmental shift remains under investigation. As survey teams mark coordinates and begin documentation, one reality stands clear. The river did not create something new. It revealed something old. And the question now is not whether the structure exists, that much is visible. The question is whether everything that happened before it surfaced was coincidence or preparation. Across the Jordan Valley, the ground is no longer stable. Sudden sinkholes are appearing without warning, tearing open the earth in broad daylight. What once looked like solid terrain collapses in seconds, leaving behind deep craters that swallow trees, roads, vehicles, and entire sections of farmland. Witnesses describe hearing a low cracking sound, followed by the terrifying moment when the surface simply gives way. Some of these sinkholes stretch dozens of feet across. Others plunge so deep that locals call them bottomless. Standing at the edge, residents report feeling the soil tremble beneath their feet, unsure whether the next collapse will happen beside them. Entire stretches of riverbank have become unsafe, forcing authorities to cordon off large areas. The instability is spreading, not shrinking. The phenomenon is not isolated. Similar collapses have increased dramatically near the Dead Sea, where receding water levels have accelerated geological instability. As the water withdraws, underground salt layers are exposed. Freshwater flowing beneath the surface dissolves these salt deposits, creating hidden cavities. Over time, the roof of these cavities weakens until it can no longer support the weight above it. When it fails, the earth caves in instantly. Scientists point to this process as the primary explanation. It is measurable, observable, and consistent with environmental shifts in the region. Water diversion, drought conditions, and long-term climate patterns have all contributed to the shrinking of surrounding water bodies. The result is a chain reaction beneath the surface. Erosion unseen, pressure building quietly, collapse inevitable. Yet beyond the geological analysis, many are asking deeper questions. The Jordan River is not an ordinary location. It is a place marked by history, covenant, and transformation. Now it is marked by instability. The symbolism is difficult to ignore. Land once associated with crossing into promise is now opening into void. Romans 8:22 states, "For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." For some believers, the collapsing earth feels like a literal echo of that verse. Not merely soil dissolving, but creation straining under pressure. Not random destruction, but visible fragility. Whether purely environmental or spiritually significant, the reality remains: the ground is failing. What appeared firm is proving temporary. And as each new sinkhole opens along the Jordan Valley, the same question rises again. Is this only natural erosion, or is the earth itself signaling something deeper beneath the surface? The ground opened, and the river answered. As sinkholes tore apart the Jordan Valley, divers were sent into unstable sections of the river to assess underwater damage. What they found beneath the shifting waters was not just debris or sediment, but history. Sharp, deliberate, forged history. Bronze and iron spearheads emerged first, then arrow tips, then fragmented sword blades, corroded but unmistakable. These were not random scraps of metal, they were weapons. Laboratory analysis later confirmed what archaeologists suspected. Many of the artifacts date back over 2,000 years. That timeline places them within some of the most turbulent chapters of ancient Israel's history. Some experts cautiously suggest connections to the era of King Saul, when early Israel fought to establish stability. Others point to the reign of King David, whose campaigns reshaped the region's political landscape. A third possibility links certain weapon styles to the Maccabean period, a time of revolt, resistance, and religious survival. What makes the discovery striking is not just the age of the weapons, but their location. These artifacts were found in a river known globally for baptism, cleansing, and renewal. The Jordan is remembered as the place where Israel crossed into promise, where prophets performed miracles, where repentance met water. Yet beneath that symbolism of peace lay instruments of war. Two primary theories have emerged. The first suggests these weapons are remnants of forgotten battles fought along the riverbanks. Ancient armies frequently clashed near strategic water sources. Soldiers fell. Equipment was lost. Flood cycles buried evidence under layers of sediment. Over centuries, the river concealed what conflict left behind. In this view, the Jordan simply preserved fragments of history, now revealed due to environmental changes. The second theory is more symbolic. Some scholars propose that these weapons were intentionally cast into the river as acts of surrender, a ritual laying down of arms before God. Ancient cultures often marked turning points with physical gestures. To discard a weapon into sacred water could signify dependence on divine protection rather than military strength. Instead of fighting with iron, trust in heaven. If that interpretation holds, then the meaning shifts dramatically. These are not leftovers of violence. They are testimonies of submission. The contrast is powerful. Blades buried beneath baptismal waters. War hidden under renewal. Steel beneath surrender. It presents a layered image. Human conflict resting beneath divine covenant. And the timing matters. These artifacts surfaced not during routine excavation, but during a season of instability, collapsing ground, receding waters, environmental stress. As the river shrinks and exposes its bed, objects long concealed are emerging, not only geological cavities but historical ones. History, resurfacing at a critical moment, invites reflection. Every generation believes it stands at a turning point, yet discoveries like this sharpen that awareness. Weapons once used in struggle now rise silently from the mud. They no longer cut, but they speak. Are they merely relics or reminders? The Jordan has always marked transition, wilderness to promise, obscurity to calling, repentance to renewal. Now it reveals a chapter of conflict beneath its calm surface. What was buried is visible again, and this may only be the beginning. Stay with us, because what appears next above the riverbanks is just as unsettling. After strong whirlpools began spinning near weak parts of the river, divers were sent back into the dark water. This time, they were not studying the current, and they were tracking strange sonar signals coming from deep beneath thick layers of mud. What they found was not broken rock or random debris. It was built. Buried in hard-packed sediment lay a stone box, rectangular, balanced, clearly shaped by human hands. Its corners were worn by time, but still sharp enough to show design. It had not been smashed by pressure. It had not drifted there by accident. It had been placed. The chest looked old, very old. Mud and minerals had slowly covered it over the years, hiding it from sight. Yet it remained sealed. The lid was heavy, cut from the same stone as the base. Across its surface were faint carved lines. At first, they looked like scratches, but under focused light, the divers saw a pattern. These were not random marks. They were symbols. The carvings were shallow, almost secret, as if they were meant to last, not to be seen. When the lid was carefully lifted under controlled conditions, the discovery inside changed everything. Within the stone chest lay pieces of an ancient scroll. The material was fragile. Parts had crumbled with age, but large sections had survived, protected by the tight seal of the box. The parchment was stained and brittle, yet clear lines of writing could still be seen. Experts moved quickly. Early analysis suggested the script resembled ancient Hebrew, not modern letters but older forms used centuries ago. Some lines were too damaged to read. Others were clear enough for study. Scholars noticed repeated words linked to covenant language: promise, oath, agreement. The text spoke about commitment, about a binding word. One phrase stood out strongly because of its familiar tone. For the word of God is living and active. Hebrews 4:12. Researchers are still studying whether the fragment directly quotes that verse or reflects the same theological theme found in biblical tradition. What is clear is this: the message centered on the power of the divine word, not as history alone, but as something alive. The symbolism is hard to ignore. A sealed stone box hidden under unstable waters. A fragile scroll preserved beneath shifting ground. Ancient covenant language rising at a time when the land itself seems unsettled. Everything around it moved. The words endured. Archaeologists are careful not to jump to conclusions. There are several possible explanations. The chest may have been hidden during war to protect sacred writings. It could have been stored and forgotten as borders changed and empires fell. It may even have been placed there as part of a ritual, meant to remain unseen beneath the river. But, whatever its origin, the discovery changes the tone of the story. The Jordan River has always stood at key moments in history. People crossed it. Promises were made beside it. Lives were changed in its waters. It has long been a place of new beginnings, but what is happening now feels heavier. Each event by itself has an explanation. Geology explains collapsing soil. Climate patterns explain insect swarms. Chemistry explains red water. Tectonic movement explains light shaking. Science offers clear processes, and those processes are real. But when all of this happens in the same sacred place within a short span of time, it feels less random. It forms a pattern that is hard to ignore. The Jordan is not just a river on a map, it represents movement, crossing over, choosing a direction, starting again. In history, when its waters shifted, something important followed, and now it is shifting again. What we are seeing is not proof of the end of the world. It is not a final warning written in the sky. It is something quieter, but still powerful. When the ground collapses, it exposes what was buried. When the water pulls back, it reveals what was hidden. When the current spins, it shows where the river is weak. Instability does one thing very clearly: it uncovers. You may see these events through science. You may see them through faith. Either way, one fact remains. The land is moving. The river is changing. And the world is paying attention. Maybe the deeper question is not whether these are supernatural signs. Maybe the question is what they stir inside us. Awareness, reflection, readiness. History often shows that major changes are preceded by subtle shifts. Small warnings come before loud ones. Movement begins beneath the surface before it becomes visible to everyone. For centuries, the Jordan has signaled transition through movement in its waters. And now, it is moving again. If this exploration made you think, pause for a moment and support the channel. Like this video so others can see it. Share your view in the comments, natural events or something more. And subscribe if you want to continue following what unfolds along the Jordan River and beyond. Thank you for watching, thank you for reflecting, and thank you for seeking truth.
This isn't the filter. The Euphrates River has turned blood red. For thousands of years, this place has been tied to biblical prophecy. So when locals saw this, they panic. As the river's color shifts, attention shifted to old sites along its banks, sealed passages, narrow chambers that feel more like holding cells, and places long forgotten. These images are pushing people back to a haunting verse. Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. Nearby, stone statues with wings stand without names or records, watching in silence. In the ruins of Babylon, carved tablets show signs of being scraped clean, as if someone wanted the words erased. Skeletons have been found, bound and sealed away. And near Mount Ararat, a boat-shaped formation still rests on the land, reminding many of the flood and a time when judgment came through water. Scripture warns that when the Euphrates changes, restraints are lifted and consequences follow. Is this only a strange natural event? Or is it something more? If you feel it is not a coincidence, then this message may be meant for you. Keep watching as the pieces come together, and before you continue, pause and pray. Lord, I am listening. Along sections of the Euphrates, the water no longer reflected the sky the way it always had. Instead of brown or green, It appeared dark red, sometimes faint, sometimes deep, like diluted blood spreading through the current. In some places, the change was gradual. In others, it felt sudden, almost overnight. Locals were the first to notice. Fishermen paused before stepping into the water. Farmers along the banks stopped drawing from the river. Some took photos. Others simply stood and watched, unsure of how to describe what they were seeing. There was no panic, no mass reaction, just a quiet sense that something was off. What made the sight unsettling was not only the color, but the way it moved. The red did not sit on the surface like mud stirred by rain. It flowed evenly, carried by the current, spreading downstream, as if the river itself had changed from within. Officials and observers offered explanations: sediment, algae, runoff, but the timing raised questions. There had been no major storms, no visible disturbance upstream, no clear event that matched the scale of the change. And so, people began asking a different kind of question. Not what caused it, but why here? Because this was not just any river, and seeing it turn red even briefly felt different. It felt symbolic, whether intended or not, a visual that stayed in the mind long after the water passed out of view. For many watching from afar, the images were enough to pause the scroll. For those standing beside the river, it was enough to make them step back and remember words they had heard long ago. As attention turned to the river itself, something else followed. Naturally, people began looking at what surrounded it. Along certain stretches of the Euphrates, places that had long been ignored were suddenly noticed again. Not because they were new, but because they had always been there, half hidden, sealed off, or quietly avoided. Narrow passages near the banks, openings cut into stone that led nowhere visible, doorways filled in long ago, as if someone wanted them closed for good. Some of these spaces felt tight and deliberate. Low ceilings, straight walls, rooms too small to live in, but too solid to be temporary. They did not look like shelters or storage. They felt more like holding spaces built to contain, not to protect. In several areas, marks showed that entrances had been blocked on purpose, stone fitted carefully, gaps filled, not collapsed. This was not random decay. It looked planned, measured, intentional. What stood out was the timing. These places had existed for years, even centuries, without drawing attention. But now, as the river changed, eyes were drawn back to them, not through excavation or discovery, but through awareness. People were simply noticing what had always been there. No official announcements followed. No clear explanations were given. Just quiet footage, still photos, and brief descriptions shared without conclusions. The kind of information that invites observation, not belief. And yet, for many, it was hard not to connect the dots. A river changing color, sealed places near its banks, structures that suggested restraint rather than ruin. Nothing here proved anything, but together they created a feeling that something long held back was being remembered again, not uncovered by force, but revealed by attention. And that, for some, was the most unsettling part. As more attention gathered around the Euphrates, a pattern began to take shape, not from one discovery, but from many small details repeating across different places. Near the river, and in nearby ruins, stone figures with wings stood in silence. No plaques, no names, no clear records explaining who placed them there or why. Their faces were worn smooth by time, but the wings remained sharply carved, deliberate in shape. They were not hidden, yet they were rarely discussed, as if everyone had learned to walk past them without asking questions. In the ruins of ancient Babylon, stone tablets told a different kind of story, not through what was written, but through what was missing. Lines had been scraped away, symbols erased, not broken by age, but rubbed smooth, as though someone had made an effort to remove meaning rather than destroy the stone itself. Elsewhere, remains were found in positions that felt intentional. Skeletons discovered bound, placed carefully, sealed within enclosed spaces. These were not scattered bones left by chaos or collapse. They suggested order, restraint, finality. Each finding on its own could be explained away. Statues weathered by time, tablets damaged by erosion, remains shaped by circumstance. But what unsettled observers was how often the same themes appeared again and again. Wings, bindings, sealed spaces, erased words. It was the repetition that stood out. Across different regions, cultures, and eras, the same symbols surfaced quietly, without announcement. They did not point loudly to a single meaning. Instead, they whispered the same idea from different angles. Something watched, something restrained, something meant to stay silent. And when these symbols were seen alongside a river turning red, many felt an uneasy connection forming. Not proof, not prophecy fulfilled, but a sense that the past was not as buried as it seemed. Sometimes, meaning does not arrive through a single sign. It emerges when the same image refuses to stop appearing. When the conversation turns to rivers, judgment, and warning, memory has a way of reaching even farther back, beyond cities, beyond ruins, beyond written records. Not far from the regions shaped by the Euphrates stands Mount Ararat, a name that has carried weight for thousands of years. It is remembered not because of what flows beside it, but because of what once rested upon it. A story passed down across cultures and generations. A flood, a reset, a moment when water did not simply destroy, but marked an ending and a beginning. Near this mountain, a boat-shaped formation still lies on the land. Weathered, silent, and unchanged by time, it does not announce itself. It simply exists. For some, it is a curiosity. For others, a reminder. Not of fear, but of precedent. The flood narrative is often misunderstood as only a story of punishment, but at its core, it is also a story of warning given in advance, of preparation, of restraint before release. The waters did not arrive without notice. They came after a long season of patience. That is why the memory matters now. When a river tied to prophecy changes before the eyes of the modern world, it naturally pulls the mind back to the last time water carried meaning on a global scale. Not because history must repeat exactly, but because patterns often echo. The flood was not sudden chaos. It followed a warning. It followed a long silence. It followed restraint. And for many watching the Euphrates today, that ancient memory stirs again, not as a prediction, but as a reminder that water has never been just water in the biblical story. It has always been a signal, a boundary, a message. Sometimes the past does not return loudly. Sometimes it surfaces quietly, when the conditions begin to look familiar. As the water continued to recede along the riverbanks, other things began to surface, not ice, but shapes that made one recoil in fear at first sight. Along the newly exposed stretches of riverbank, eroded stone statues gradually emerged. They didn't stand upright like religious statues, nor were they placed in temples. Instead, they lay tilted, half submerged, half exposed, as if deliberately hidden. What puzzled observers was their form. Winged, humanoid figures, but with animalistic features, neither entirely human nor entirely animal. There were no names, no inscriptions, no familiar religious symbols accompanied them. Researchers found that these statues did not correspond to any deities recorded in ancient belief systems. They don't look like objects of worship. Instead, their distorted body proportions, oversized wings, and stiff torsos evoke a sense of power, threat, and instability. These aren't figures made for people to bow down to. The Bible contains a short but haunting warning. Satan disguised himself as an angel of light. 2 Corinthians 11:14. This verse doesn't describe the form, but the nature of the deception, of the appearance, may be bright, but the purpose is not. When that verse is placed alongside these statues, some can't help but wonder, are these symbolic memories of entities once considered outside of God's order? No one claims these are real creatures. No one says they ever walked the earth. But history shows that ancient people often used symbols to record things they couldn't explain in words. And when those symbols suddenly emerged from the earth, at the same time as ice, silence, and other upheavals, the question was no longer what they were, but why did they appear at this particular moment? As the waters recede, the story doesn't end at those silent stone formations. It leads us straight to Babylon, a place where the past seems locked away by fear. At the Alphiadia site, excavations have revealed 478 deliberately damaged artifacts.
¡Ojo con los cables! ¡Sí va! ¡Se viene todo eso!
In a matter of weeks, Jerusalem shifted. Rivers surge past their limits without warning. Solid ground caves in, swallowing as if they were never there. And beneath it all, dark residue surfaced from ancient layers, long buried. Individually, each event could be explained, but they did not occur in isolation. They unfolded together, compressed in time, layered in meaning, accelerating. History rarely announces turning points in advance. Before we decide what any of this means, do you believe these are just natural events? Or could this be the kind of warning Jesus told us to watch for? Stay with us as we are going to look carefully at what is actually happening. Please click the like and subscribe button to support us. Thank you so much. Let's look carefully at what is actually happening. In early spring, the city expected renewal. The rains had been steady through the colder months. The cisterns were full. The terraces along the hillsides showed the first signs of green. Yet what came was not a single violent storm, but a slow tightening, an unseen pressure gathering across the valleys and wadis surrounding the ancient city. Cool air lingered longer than it should have, pressing down from the higher elevations toward the Kidron Valley. At the same time, late seasonal rains fell upon ground already saturated. The limestone soil, layered and compacted by centuries, could take no more. Along the slopes east of the city, runnels of brown water traced their way through olive groves, cutting across footpaths that had been dry only days before. Low boundary walls built from stacked stone weakened and collapsed in sections. Life adjusted, as it always had. Children remained indoors, while elders checked the integrity of cistern covers. Neighbors worked side by side, clearing debris from channels with wooden tools, reinforcing earthen banks with stones carried by hand. Only after the danger became undeniable did deeper questions surface. When spring, a season meant for planting and steady growth, brings rising waters instead, survival comes first. Meaning follows later. Yet in Scripture, when water crosses its boundaries, it is rarely described as meaningless. In the writings attributed to Isaiah, the earth is said to stagger when its order is shaken, not merely as a physical event, but as a sign that deeper foundations are being tested. What unsettled many was not only the overflow, but how quickly it became routine. Stones were rearranged, new paths were memorized, barriers were built higher. What had first felt like disruption slowly blended into daily life. Jesus described his return not with constant visible upheaval, but with an atmosphere of normal life continuing uninterrupted. In the Gospel of Matthew 24:37-39, he compared that day to the time before the flood, people eating, planting, building, unaware that history was approaching a turning point. The emphasis was not chaos, but complacency. Not destruction alone, but surprise. The return of Christ, according to his own words, will arrive in a world still functioning, fields tended, homes occupied, routines intact. The dividing line will not be drawn by who noticed the rain, but by who understood what it meant. As the waters of the valley press against their banks, and the streets of Jerusalem mirror the sky above, one question lingers beneath the surface. Will the people pause to discern what this crossing of boundaries reveals, or will they simply adapt, stone by stone, and learn to live with it, overlooking the warning written plainly across the land? It was still within that calm that something unexpected emerged. High along the ridge of the Mount of Olives, the earth began to open. Not with a roar, not with an explosion, but with a subtle tearing sound, stone shifting against stone. A narrow fracture appeared across the surface of the hillside, thin at first, almost easy to overlook. Then it lengthened. It crept forward through the soil, splitting ancient pathways and cutting across terraces that had stood undisturbed for centuries. What unsettled observers was not only the crack itself, but its direction. The fracture did not spread randomly. It traced a visible line westward, descending the slope as though drawn with intention. Smaller fissures branched from it, but the main tier held a steady course, angled toward the sealed eastern entrance of the old city, the Golden Gate. From above, the pattern resembled a pathway carved by unseen hands, guiding the eye from the summit of the mount directly toward the ancient stones of the gate. People gathered at a distance, standing silently along the ridge. Just hours earlier, the same ground had supported pilgrims, shepherds, and travelers. Now the soil lay split open, revealing layers of rock beneath, jagged, uneven, unstable. Pebbles and fragments slid downward into the widening seam. The disturbance did not level buildings or swallow entire streets. It did something quieter, yet deeply unsettling. It altered what had always been trusted as fixed. The Mount of Olives has long stood as a witness to history, overlooking the Temple Mount, the valleys, the gates. To see its surface divided and seemingly aligned toward the Golden Gate stirred questions that went beyond geology. Scholars quickly pointed to natural explanations. Seasonal rains can loosen limestone formations. Subsurface erosion can create tension within rock layers. Minor tectonic adjustments, even when unfelt, can produce visible fractures. From a scientific standpoint, these possibilities are reasonable. Yet for many who know the Hebrew Scriptures, the imagery felt striking. The prophet Zechariah wrote of a day when the Mount of Olives would be split, forming a valley from east to west. Zechariah 14:4. The text speaks not of chaos for its own sake, but of a moment when the Lord stands upon the mount and the landscape itself responds. Whether read symbolically or literally, the passage has shaped expectation for centuries. To witness even a small fracture upon that same ridge, stretching in the direction of the eastern gate, naturally draws the mind back to those words. This does not demand panic. It invites reflection. Is this merely a geological event in a city built upon fault lines, or is it a reminder that even the most ancient ground can shift when deeper purposes are at work? As the ground began to shift in Jerusalem in early spring, attention turned quickly toward the heart of the city. What had been discussed in quiet meetings and private gatherings was now moving into public view. Preparations connected to the long-anticipated construction of a third temple were no longer theoretical. Survey teams were seen taking measurements. Stone samples were examined. Certain priestly garments and ritual vessels, long preserved in expectation, were quietly displayed again for instruction and review. The atmosphere in the city was not chaotic, but it was charged. Plans that had circulated for years were now being spoken of with urgency. Groups devoted to temple restoration increased their activity. Training in ancient rites resumed with renewed seriousness. Discussions about altar placement, foundational alignment, and ritual purity were no longer distant concepts, but active considerations. What had once seemed symbolic began to feel procedural. At the same time, tension intensified. Security around sensitive areas tightened. Political leaders urged caution. Religious authorities debated timelines and legitimacy. Each announcement carried weight far beyond the city itself. Jerusalem has never been merely local. Every development within its walls echoes outward. What concerned many observers was not a single action, but the acceleration. Conversations that once stretched across decades now seemed compressed into months. Amid these developments, one image stood out. Small groups gathered in prayer near the eastern side of the city, not as organized demonstrations, but as quiet appeals. No banners, no amplified speeches. Just individuals facing the direction where the ancient sanctuary once stood, asking for wisdom, protection, and clarity. Their posture reflected something deeper than political aspiration. It reflected awareness that human plans, especially in Jerusalem, cannot move forward without consequence. This moment is testing more than engineering capability or administrative resolve. It is testing spiritual discernment. When foundations are discussed in a city where foundations carry prophetic meaning, the question becomes larger than construction. It touches covenant, history, and expectation. The Hebrew Scriptures repeatedly tie Jerusalem's sanctuary to obedience and reverence. In Haggai, the people are urged to consider your ways before rebuilding the house of the Lord. Haggai 1-5-7. The emphasis is not merely on structure, but on alignment of heart and purpose. Building without reflection is portrayed as hollow. Construction without humility invites instability. As preparations quietly advance and debates grow more intense, a deeper question lingers over the city. Is this simply the unfolding of historical ambition, or a moment requiring spiritual examination? Jerusalem has seen temples rise and fall before. Each time, the visible stones reflected invisible realities. In early spring, as activity increases and attention sharpens, the issue is no longer whether something can be built. The greater question is whether those involved are prepared not only with materials and plans, but with reverence, wisdom, and awareness of the weight carried by every stone laid in this city. As attention in Jerusalem centered increasingly on sacred ground and renewed religious discussions, another development began to draw quiet concern. It did not involve structural collapse or visible fracture. It involved something surfacing, something long buried beneath layers of earth and time. Near the southern approaches to the city, in areas not far from the ancient valleys that bordered Jerusalem, dark residue began appearing along exposed soil and stone. It was thick, almost tar-like in texture. Not mud. Not runoff from rainfall. It clung to rock surfaces and pooled in shallow depressions. There were no nearby industrial sites to explain it, no transport accidents, no modern source that could account for the material. At first, it was dismissed as isolated seepage, small patches, easily overlooked. But reports increased. The substance was not emerging from a single crack or channel. It appeared in separate points, scattered across different elevations, as if rising upward from beneath rather than flowing downward from above. Researchers who examined samples suggested that what was surfacing was not recent contamination. The composition pointed to ancient organic deposits, material compressed and sealed beneath sediment layers for centuries. This was not creation. It was exposure. Jerusalem has witnessed similar moments before. Historical records describe episodes where hidden chambers were uncovered during construction near the city of David. Ancient scrolls were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea after centuries of silence. What unsettled observers was not merely the material itself, but the convergence of timing, discussions about sacred rebuilding, renewed focus on temple service, heightened excavation in and around historically sensitive zones, and now, beneath it all, the land releasing something old. The Hebrew scriptures often frame such moments as revelations rather than accidents. In Ecclesiastes it is written, "There is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought to light." Ecclesiastes 12:14. Jerusalem is a city civilizations have built, destroyed, buried, and rebuilt upon the same ground. Each generation leaves something beneath the next. When ancient matter surfaces unexpectedly, it forces a question deeper than geology. What else lies beneath historically, spiritually, covenantally, that has yet to be brought into the open? As attention in Jerusalem continued to focus on sacred preparations and shifting ground, another development unfolded quietly on the eastern side of the city. Along the slopes, descending toward the wilderness beyond the Dead Sea Road, unusual earthen formations began to draw notice. They were not sinkholes. They were not fractures. Instead, several tall mounds of compacted soil had risen into narrow columns, upright, hardened, and strikingly shaped. Their surfaces appeared crusted and pale, as if baked by years of mineral seepage and compression. At first, they were dismissed as natural erosion. Wind and water have sculpted the hills around Jerusalem for centuries. Yet what unsettled observers was not merely their height, but their posture. These columns did not lean randomly. They stood rigid, elongated, almost human in outline. From certain angles, the silhouettes resembled figures frozen mid-step. Even more striking was their orientation. The majority of the formations faced west toward the city itself, toward Jerusalem. Locals who passed by began to speak quietly of the resemblance to the ancient account of Lot's wife, turned into a pillar after looking back toward Sodom. The comparison was not precise, yet it was difficult to ignore. The shapes were not broad hills or scattered ridges. They were singular, vertical, and solitary, and they faced the city as though fixed in permanent gaze. Geologists offered practical explanations. Layers of sediment mixed with mineral-rich groundwater can harden unevenly over time. When surrounding soil erodes, denser cores may remain standing as natural pillars. Pressure, evaporation, and long-term environmental exposure can produce rigid columns from what was once loose earth. Such phenomena have been recorded in desert regions before. Yet Jerusalem is not merely a geological site. It is a city saturated with narrative memory. When forms in the land echo ancient imagery, interpretation inevitably follows. Historically, similar moments have shaped reflection in this region. The rediscovery of long-buried altars altered national direction. The uncovering of forgotten scrolls redefined covenantal awareness. Even natural events have repeatedly been read not only as physical occurrences, but as mirrors, forcing the people to examine posture, direction, and allegiance. The meaning, then, does not rest in whether the columns are miraculous. It rests in what they symbolize. In the Genesis account, Lot's wife is not judged for movement alone, but for orientation, for looking back toward what she was commanded to leave behind. The pillar becomes a symbol of divided loyalty, of hesitation between past and future, a fixed reminder that direction matters. Now, in early spring, as Jerusalem wrestles with questions of identity, heritage, and sacred rebuilding, upright earthen forms stand east of the city, facing its walls. Whether shaped purely by erosion or by deeper forces of time, their presence carries metaphorical weight. They appear as witnesses, silent, unmoving, directed toward the place where covenant history converges. The deeper question is not how wind and minerals formed them. It is what their orientation suggests, in a season when Jerusalem itself stands at a crossroads of intention. Are these pillars merely remnants of erosion, or do they serve as a visual parable reminding a city shaped by obedience and exile that posture toward its calling matters more than appearance? The land around Jerusalem has always spoken through stone. This time, it speaks through figures of earth upright, still, and facing the city as if asking a single, quiet question. Which direction will you choose? Why did Jesus say, "Remember Lot's wife"? Lot's wife is remembered for looking back at the cities while they were being destroyed when God commanded them not to do so. Some wonder how we know she turned into a pillar of salt, and that can be explained by the simple idea that someone was behind her when she turned. In regards to what Jesus stated in Luke 17, he is recorded as telling the disciples about the end times and how disastrous they are going to be, even much worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. This is when he mentions Lot's wife in verse 32. It means that when Jerusalem was being destroyed by the Romans, the people who are fleeing were not supposed to stop to get personal effects or get friends or family. They would have to have regard only for their lives to flee the destruction. It also has a meaning for Christians today in that we cannot live with both feet, so to speak, in this world. Although we live here, our hearts ought to be with the Lord and our future home with Him. We are here to do the Lord's work, but we are not supposed to put all our hopes and desires into the things of the world other than family. Our focus needs to be on Christ. Jesus interpreted Mosaic law out of Deuteronomy when asked by the Pharisees to weigh in on a running dispute as to justification. Moses had told the Israelites what to do if a man found some uncleanness in his wife. He had to write her a bill of divorcement. The debate was serious. If the uncleanness was adultery, divorce would not be necessary. The woman could have been stoned to death. If the uncleanness was less than adultery, then what qualified for grounds? Some men would be happy to make some excuse to dump the old lady and then be free to marry someone else. Others, a little more righteous, felt that it should not be so easy. But where to draw the line? It should be said that Jesus was not legislating new divorce policy in this passage. He was expounding on Old Testament law and explaining it in light of the fully revealed will of God. God had already told Israel, "I hate divorce." So why a provision for it? Jesus explained that it was not God's ideal plan for marriage that such situations would exist, but in accommodation for the hardness of their hearts, the mechanism was created. The woman would not be thrown out to merely fend for herself. The bill of divorcement was understood by many to provide some arrangement for the woman's future. But Jesus stated that these frivolous divorces that take advantage of what amounted to a humanitarian provision for the worst of cases really were so unrighteous as to not be recognized in the eyes of God, and the man who divorced his wife for the actual purpose of hooking up with someone else was trying to legitimize adultery, and they would be judged for that. The only exception Jesus noted was sexual impurity. This being the case, it settles a side issue at the same time. Just because adultery could be punished by stoning to death, it did not necessarily have to be so. In fact, this was the case of the prophet Hosea, whose wife Gomer apparently got around a fair bit. God instructed Hosea to put up with her for the time being, as she was a perfect example of unfaithful Israel in their relationship with God. Hosea was to take her back when she came to the end of her run, as God was patiently waiting to do the same for His own wayward people. But Jesus did not enact a new law that was harder to keep than even the old one was. He merely demonstrated the meaning of the passage in terms of the Old Covenant. His teaching is an encouragement for married people to work out their differences rather than opt for the easy way out. But one condition that existed in Moses' day is still with us today. People are just as hard-hearted as ever. So it should be stated, on the record, that while divorce is certainly a failure, and not generally as things should be, we sometimes find ourselves in situations where there really is no choice. God loves and forgives. Divorce is not the unforgivable sin, and remarriage can often solve many problems and give people a second chance. To stand in the way of that on religious grounds is harmful to the divorced party, as well as any children that may be involved. The financial situation can be very oppressive, and a remarriage can cure that. I personally don't believe that God expects people to live in poverty and squalor with their children begging for crumbs when a new, healthy nuclear family can be formed from the ashes of a broken marriage. It is out of character, cruel, and harsh. God loves and forgives. I think we should join him in that. Remember Lot's wife, said Jesus. That is probably the most dramatic, potent illustration the Master ever used in a sermon. As we read the context, it is very obvious that the words were being applied to those living on this planet right now. In that day refers to the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Here is what Jesus actually said. Likewise also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven, and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day he which shall be upon the housetop, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away, and he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife. Luke 17:28, 3:2. What did Jesus mean by that cryptic expression, remember Lot's wife? What does that woman of long ago have to do with people who are watching the closeout of history? Why did the Master relate Mrs. Lot to our day? Jesus used her as a fearful warning. That woman became cold, careless, and disobedient. Finally, the judgments of God fell upon her, and she became a pillar of salt on the plains of Sodom. Lot's good intentions. But let's come back to the story of Lot's wife and try to understand what Jesus wants us to learn from her example. According to the Bible record, she belonged to one of the finest families in the East. As the nephew of Abraham, Lot shared the tremendous faith of his uncle and prayed at Abraham's altar. When God's call came to get out of Mesopotamia, Lot went right along with Abraham, not knowing where the call might lead. Together they brought their families to the entering place of the Promised Land and offered their sacrifices of thanksgiving. Then dissension erupted between the herdsmen of the two wealthy kinsmen. Their vast combined flocks and herds didn't have enough room to graze in such a restricted area, and they had to separate. Lot was given the choice of direction as the whole land stretched out before him. On one side lay the verdant hills with their lofty trees. The other led down into the crowded centers of commerce and trade. The materialistic appeal of the prosperous cities had an immediate impact on Lot, and the Bible records very simply that he pitched his tent toward Sodom, Genesis 13:12. The predictable pattern of future tragedy was settled by that early decision to move near those wicked cities. Lot stands forth as a man of good intentions. Quite obviously, he did not actually plan to take his family into the urban environment of sinful Sodom. He would only live in the vicinity, where he could take advantage of the economic opportunities of such a bustling trade capital. Very likely he made special mental reservations about letting his family mingle with the degraded inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. In fact, he had no idea at all of giving up his religion. His move was prompted by selfish concern over temporal advantages, and he had no intention of losing anything. But what happened in spite of all the wonderful intentions? Poor Lot lost his wife, his possessions, and almost his own life. Good intentions were not good enough. He moved closer and closer to the cities, until finally he actually moved in to dwell with the Sodomites. His plans to guard the spiritual interests of his children failed to materialize. All his rationalization about counteracting the wickedness with stricter prayer schedules and family altar religion just didn't seem to work out as planned. He gradually compromised with the environment and watched his children slowly assimilate the ways of their heathen neighbors. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and keep an eye out for our next video. Leave a comment and let us know what you think.
هذا رسول الله حبيب الله أشرف خلق الله أعظم العالمين.
بحر الكويت الآن، يا سبحان الله.
نتيجة الحفريات بنشوف التشققات في أماكن مختلفة وأثرها الكبير على متانة المباني وعلى
Something unusual has begun unfolding in Jerusalem quietly, layer by layer. Within a short span of time, observers reported a moving beam of light above the Temple Mount, shifting quietly as prayers rose below. Days later, the ground along the Mount of Olives revealed a narrow fracture, followed by a brief vibration of ancient stones near the sealed Golden Gate, detected without any recorded earthquake. Then, in the silence of the night, a deep trumpet-like sound echoed from beneath the streets of the old city. Individually, each event can be explained, but together they form a pattern touching the sky, the ground, the structures, and the hidden spaces below, raising a single question: are these isolated disturbances, or the early stages of a message unfolding? Before we dive into details, please consider liking this video and pressing the subscribe button. Every contribution does great things. Thank you very much. Imagine this. Just after evening prayers, a narrow beam of light formed high above the Temple Mount. At first, many assumed it was a military aircraft passing overhead, or simply a reflection of powerful spotlights from nearby tourist areas shining into the night sky. But within minutes, observers noticed something unusual. The light did not remain still. It moved. What drew the most attention was the way it moved. Each time groups gathered in prayer, the beam seemed to shift slowly, gliding from one section of the mount to another, pausing as voices rose, then continuing again when the prayers quieted. People watching from nearby rooftops and streets recorded the same pattern. When prayer lines formed, the light hovered. When they dispersed, it drifted forward again. It did not flash randomly or scatter across the clouds. It held its shape thin, bright, and steady, moving with a rhythm that felt connected to the moments unfolding below.